to Casa Árabe, to this session on the geopolitics of gas. And as part of our activity, we want to analyze not only our environment, but also everything that actually affects the Mediterranean area and then both sides of the Mediterranean, actually, and above all, in relationship to the current affairs that is changing so much and so aggressive in the last few days. A couple of days ago, we wanted to hold a roundtable on the geopolitics of hunger, focusing more on, as many of you will know, the increase in the price of corn and cereals, the shortage of food, and how this affects, for example, sunflower oil, and how this is all part of a production system which has a lot of bottlenecks in it because of the way it's organized and because of the extreme dependency that we have on other countries and nations. And above all, in the case of hydrocarbons, it's not a different story, because obviously there are some differences there, but the war in Ukraine, which began in the spring of this year, has brought with it several consequences for the population on a global scale. And as I said, it affects the gas supply, and it's clearly affecting us there. According to the Eurostat data in Europe, the gas is 46% from Russia, 20% from Norway, 11% from Algeria, and 5% Qatari gas. And as we know, not all members of the European Union suffer or have the same vulnerabilities vis-à-vis Russia, but energy stability from the European bloc is clearly threatened thanks to the European sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, but also the response on behalf of Vladimir Putin's regime has had an effect. And this situation has meant that alternatives are being searched for in order to face up to this problem and this energy shortage. And there is a general race underway in order to attempt to no longer depend on Russia. But this is not only something that is very complex to achieve, but also very expensive to achieve. So the idea of this roundtable is to better understand this situation, to see what possible alternatives there might be out there, and how that involves directly or indirectly those countries that are of interest to the institution, i.e. North African countries or from the Gulf. And we're going to talk about liquid natural gas, LNG, which is one of the options out there, with Qatar as the main supplier in Europe. But also, we know that there is a great deal of diversity in the supply of gas. There's the United States, there's Nigeria, there's Algeria. And there's a whole series of possible combinations in order to be able to face up to or to offset the supply from Russia. It's no secret that there's political instability too in our neighbors from the south. And after the Arab Spring, as they're called, and after the popular uprisings that took place, there's countries like Libya, for example, countries such as Algeria even, that have seen internal instability. And more recently, too, there have been problems between the neighboring countries, such as Algeria and Morocco and Spain. And all of this, of course, is also affecting the supply of gas. Geopolitics. The Geopolitics of Gas is the title of this event, and it's a great pleasure to have with us our two experts, Carole Nakhle, who has come from London in order to give us this presentation. She's founder and executive director of Crystol Energy. She's a specialist in politics, finances, development of markets, governance, energy taxes, fiscal regimes, and geopolitics. She's an advisor of the International Tax and Investment Center with headquarters in Washington and a leading expert in energy with the Geopolitical Intelligence Services. She also participates in the dialogue of politics of the OCDE on development based on natural resources. She also founded in 2007 the non-profit organization Access for Women in Energy. And in 2017, she was awarded the prize for professional recognition of the United Kingdom for the magazine in Tunis, and she was selected CEO in the UK by the CEO Monthly. She was selected CEO of the Year, in the United Kingdom. And it's a pleasure to be with you here, Carole. And we also have Gonzalo Escribano, who's Director of the Energy and Climate Change Program of the Real Instituto Elcano and Professor from the Department of Applied Economics from the UNED for Economic Policies. She researches matters to do with international energy and foreign policies for Spain and European foreign policy, energy geopolitics, energy security, renewable energies, amongst other things. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, Gonzalo, a good friend of this house or this institution. And without further ado, as you well know, we'll have approximately an hour talking to our experts and they with us. And then we will have a round of questions and comments, not only from those of you who are here with us in the auditorium, but also from those of you who are following us on our YouTube channel on Casa Árabe. So, Carole, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Karim. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. And before we started, I told Karim that only when we're about to land over Madrid, I realized that this is the first time I come to Madrid. I've been to Barcelona all the time, but I don't know why in my head I thought I was coming to Madrid quite often, but it turned out it's the first time I come here. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to be hit by very strong heat, let alone the very long queue for taxis at the airport. But I made it at the end. What I want to cover with you today, and this comes with a bit of warning that I'm an economist, so I have lots of graphs, but don't worry about it, because it's just I'm going to convey certain messages that we put what's happening in the global scene of relevance to this region. And it's interesting to see developments in economics on what's happening in global economies, the major economies in the world, how it's also impacting energy and how energy is impacting global economics and global economy, and how and what kind of influence we'll have on geopolitics as well. And there's a lot happening in these areas. That's why I call it the perfect storm. And I can easily take a few hours going through each one of them to discuss the key issues. But I thought I'm going to touch on the most pressing issues, and then later we can go to the detail and then discuss if this is if certain things are of interest. But this is what I have for you today. First of all, we look at the economic outlook, like what are the main economic challenges that we are facing around the world today. Then look at the perspectives of energy markets globally, and then look at oil, and then I would come to gas, because people look at oil and gas together as if they are the same thing. While we explore them in the same way, we extract them in the same way, but they are very completely different animals when it comes to markets. So that's something to understand when we talk about sanctioning Russia, or the impact of Russia on gas markets, its grip on European markets, what kind of role North Africa can play in Europe. So if we don't have this kind of distinction between oil and gas clear, I fear that we can end up giving recommendations that are disconnected from the reality. But let's have a quick look at the economic outlook first. It would be simplistic to blame everything we have today on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has come on top of a crisis like no other. That was the lockdown related to the pandemic. And the IMF described the pandemic, COVID-19, a crisis like no other, because all economies around the world were brought down to a standstill. That's it. We're not driving, we're not going to work, we're sitting at home. So you can easily see a very deep dip in economic growth, in our spending pattern, in demand for oil, for energy. So add on top of that, only 2 years later, and mind you, the effect of the pandemics are still with us today. So it's not something, because it was a major hit, we cannot expect it to be over suddenly. So even if the virus may not be spreading in the same aggressive way, the policies that were implemented to deal with the pandemic will have repercussions for years to come. So they are not over yet. But add on top of that a major geopolitical instability, that is the invasion of Ukraine, where you have two important players in global commodity markets. Ukraine in terms of exports as a transit route for Russian gas to Europe, but also for other commodities such as, for example, grain, wheat and corn. And Russia, which is the largest exporter of natural gas and the second largest exporter of oil, being involved in this war. And there is no clear end in sight. Then add to that, so we have the economy, we have energy, with the geopolitical development, but add to that what Karim was referring to in his opening remark, the potential food crisis. Because remember, poorer countries are still struggling with the impact of COVID. Add to that they are importing most of the commodities they need to run their economies, to keep their people satisfied and not fall into hunger. They are faced with really high import bills, and that will have massive repercussions on their standard of living, on their economic outlook. So that's why I call it a crisis soufflé for those of you who like to bake. I don't like to bake, but I always like this comparison because the soufflé, you kind of build up layers on top of each other. And that's why I call it the perfect storm, and there is no clear end in sight. But for the non-economists among you, what am I showing you here? This is a general level of inflation. Inflation reflects the general price level in an economy. And you can see how we were, I don't know, is there so you can see here how we had the pandemic, 2020, March 2020, we start to see lockdown around the world. But before that, it started in China in winter, in December 2019. But then since the recovery, look how fast prices have gone up. In the EU, in the US, the UK, and Germany, you can see how the inflation rates are reaching record levels that we have not seen for at least 40 years. And I tell you, when I go in London to do some shopping at the supermarket, I'm amazed by how much prices have increased, even from small items to the largest item. You can feel it. That's what we call inflation. And inflation is an economic problem. And it is an economic problem because people will struggle to spend. So if you have 100 euros today, it buys you a certain amount of goods, but tomorrow that 100 euros will buy you a smaller quantity of goods. So the money starts to lose its value. So it's a major economic problem. And that's why you can see around the world, if you look at the various forecasts of, let's say, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or the OECD, there is a consensus that everywhere around the world, most economies are seeing their economic outlook being downgraded. So, for example, the world. We used to think that the world was going to grow at 4.4% this year. And then a few months later in April, we said that, no, hold on a minute, that was too ambitious, and we reduced the expectations to 3.6%. The same thing for the US, the euro area, from 3.9% to 2.8%. And these revisions have happened only in 3 months' time. So it's not like between 1 year and the other. The first one shows the IMF expectations in January 2022. Only they revised them downwards in April 2022. Except, the main exception here is the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait. So really the big players in the energy scene. There they are perhaps the only main region in the world where, unlike everybody else, economic outlook has seen an upgrade. So Saudi Arabia, for instance, has seen, while everybody else saw a decline outside the region, an increase of 3% improvement in its economic outlook. Why? Because they are the largest exporter of oil, and we saw oil prices increase tremendously, and that is bringing a lot of money to the local economy. You can see how the red bar here, it shows you how they were all suffering from their economy shrinking, only to see this kind of massive increase in their economy. So I call it that they are having really their heydays in their economy. But when you look at the whole region, the Middle East and North Africa, since we are here in an institution that focuses on the Arab region, we have to be careful because the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA, is a very divergent region. So you do have the wealthy oil and gas producers which are enjoying great revenues coming from selling oil and gas at high prices, but you also have those that are importing various commodities, including oil and gas. There you can see that their economies are shrinking. So we have to be careful, and then later, if you want, we can engage in the discussion. But when we think about the Middle East and North Africa, it's a pretty divergent region in terms of economic outlook, but also in terms of income distribution and income inequality, among other things. So this is the scene on the global economic outlook. So except in the Gulf region, everywhere else the economic outlook is pretty gloomy. What about energy markets? This here, without going through the detail, is just the example showing you gas prices in Europe, the top bar, and other prices. So you have gas prices in the US, you have LNG prices, liquefied natural gas in Japan, and you have oil prices. So the reason why I'm showing you this is just to give you an idea about the size of the crisis that Europe is facing. Because yes, oil prices have increased, but it's nothing compared to the rise in gas prices in Europe. You see the massive gap between the top line and the other line. So what's happening in gas markets in Europe is, of course, in line with what's happening elsewhere, but the increase in prices has overtaken increases in prices anywhere else. And that's why it deserves serious attention and more discussion in terms of what is going to happen in Europe. But mind you, it's not just energy in terms of oil, gas, and coal. When you think about the energy transition, you need lots of metals and minerals to build wind turbines, to build solar panels. And there, the price of those metals and minerals, I mean, here I use lithium and cobalt. You use lithium, use it for battery, for electric vehicles, for instance, to store energy. Also there, you can see how prices jumped tremendously. And that by itself, for those of you who are interested in climate change policies, what would that mean for the energy transition? So it's not just prices of fuel that have increased, but also the prices of commodities that we need to build more renewable energy around the world. So the cost has also increased. I'm not going to spend time on this one. I just want to show you one thing. Why I want to focus today on oil and gas in particular. This slide here is very powerful in my opinion, because every time I display it, people raise eyebrows, because you hear a lot about the energy transition and renewable energy. We can have a debate, Gonzalo, later on about it. But what you have here in the lower bar is is actually the sources of energy that we use to produce electricity in the world. So we had the share of coal, natural gas and oil. Together, we call them fossil fuel. They provided 64% of the electricity around the world. The rest is coming from hydro, coming from nuclear, and from renewable energy, the green bar here. Fast forward 35 years later, 2020, you can see that fossil fuels, that is coal, gas, and oil, still provide the lion's share of electricity. They still provide 61% of electricity around the world. And actually, natural gas has been expanding at the cost of coal and oil, but here renewable energy has been expanding not at mainly the share of fossil fuel, but the share of nuclear. And that's why we need to think, when we talk about the energy transition, what does that mean? How much effort we need to put into accelerating the energy transition? And what does the crisis today mean for our quest for energy transition? Because when you look at these numbers, you can see that we have a mammoth challenge, because in 35 years, we reduced our dependence on fossil fuel by only 3% in power generation, electricity generation. Not only that, I call today the age of confusion. Last year, in May 2021, the International Energy Agency said if we are to achieve our net zero targets, our climate change targets of achieving net zero by 2050, we should not invest anymore in oil and gas beyond 2021. So if you had projects you invested in up to 2021, you develop them, but don't bother in putting any money in oil and gas after that. Fast forward 1 year later. This is the business secretary in the UK. He said it publicly in a tweet after he was attacked by climate change lobbyists. He said, you can shout and scream as much as you want, but I am not going to sacrifice energy security for the sake of climate change. Or he did not say it, that bluntly, but you can see here, you can read the quote, what he said. But also the EU, which is the most aggressive region in terms of climate change policies, we could see, I'm not going to call it a U-turn because the policies are still there. There is still a drive for renewable energy, for investment in nuclear energy, but there is also a realization that we still need gas and even coal. So that came in the EU REP Power EU plan published in May 2022. So just 1 year made a huge impact on policy decisions around the world because people came to realize that energy security should not be put a second or not, at the bottom of the list in terms of priorities for energy policy. It should be actually treated along the same way as climate security because, in my opinion, this is my personal opinion, I don't think you can achieve climate security without energy security. Now, the problem with this kind of shift in policy, and this is where I'm interested in, what kind of signal are you sending for investors? What is investment in energy? Investment in energy is something for the long term. You put your capital today, you put your capital over the next few years so that you get some returns in the long term. But if policymakers are changing their views between 1 year and the other, you're not going to see the investment that you need in oil and gas, and you're not going to see the investment that you need in renewable or green energy. So that's why we need, I think what we have today, the crisis, is actually a wake-up call for a more focused energy policy to send the right signal to investors if we are complaining that there is not much investment happening neither in oil and gas nor in green energy. This takes me to oil markets, and there is a bit of geopolitics. My problem, I cannot see the time, so I don't want to be carried away. So somebody, maybe Gonzalo, you can show me your watch from time to time. All right. So I'm going to go quickly to the oil markets, and then we can focus more on gas. But with oil markets, these are oil prices. This is a dip that we saw in April 2020. For the first time ever in the history of the industry, we saw oil prices going negative. They were what we call WTI, American prices. They went negative. And for something who's not familiar with economics, they didn't really understand what does it mean to have negative prices. But negative prices simply meant that producers were paying people to take their oil away because they didn't have place to store it. That was the situation April 2020, so not long time ago. Fast forward a few years later, you can see how prices recovered, and they maintained their upward march until where we are today, and they are exceeded by far the levels that we saw before the crisis. I mean, that is for me, for somebody who has studied the industry for many, many years, that is perhaps the fastest recovery in oil prices that we have seen. Of course, demand recovered after the pandemic hit, so we went back to our offices gradually. We started traveling gradually. But if you ask me who took most of the credit behind this rapid escalation in prices, it is primarily OPEC and its allies in the organization. That's what we call OPEC+. So just a little bit of brief on OPEC. So OPEC has been around since 1960. And it was led primarily by Arab countries, but you also have Venezuela, Nigeria, Angola, and other countries from all around the world. Indonesia, for example, used to be a member, but then it suspended its membership. But you can see the main players are the Arab producers, led by Saudi Arabia. And you can see here their level of production, that the Arab countries absorb the lion's share. Algeria and Libya are also members of OPEC. But in December 2016, something new happened. Another group of producers decided to join forces with OPEC, and they were led by Russia. Actually, this data is from May 2022, but if I were to show you the production of Russia last year or before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was almost producing the same level of Saudi Arabia. And there were other smaller producers coming to the group like Kazakhstan, Oman, Azerbaijan. The whole group became OPEC+. But you can see that the two main players in this organization, in this alliance, is actually Saudi Arabia and Russia. And there's lots of reasons behind this alliance, but recently, for several months now, the G7, the EU, the US have been asking OPEC to put more oil in the market, and they have been refusing it until last month. So in May, they decided to put a little bit more oil in the market. Now, people expected that OPEC will suspend Russia from its membership, because they are saying that by supporting Russia, you are still allowing massive revenues to come to Russian economy. And it's true, the main source of income for the Russian government is oil and gas exports. But OPEC and Saudi Arabia are thinking more about the long term. They know that if they want to have more power in the market in the long term, they need an important producer with them. Because Russia today, even under the sanctions, is still a much bigger producer than all other OPEC producers except Saudi Arabia. It produces more than double what Iraq produces. It produces more than 3 times what the UAE produces, etc. So losing such an important ally from this group, producers group that many describe as a cartel, would weaken the influence of the cartel over the market, especially, and that's what I have for you for later, if the market starts to shrink, if we start to lose demand in the market. And for those who say that OPEC does not have enough oil to replace Russian oil in the EU, they are not reading the data. Because this is how much the EU is getting from Russia, and this is how much we have capacity in OPEC that is not being put in the market. So if the OPEC wants to really replace Russian oil in the EU, they do have the capacity to do that, because that's at least what the data is telling us. So lots of geopolitics and economics and strategy around that. But as I said earlier, OPEC is not sad to see prices where they are today. They are getting lots of economic benefit, but there is also strategic benefit to keep the group, the alliance together in the long term. Now, just one thing I want to highlight, because people might say why the economies are not collapsing under the current pressure of prices. And this is something I have to highlight because I understand that many of you are economists, so to just distinguish between real and nominal. In actual real term, if you take inflation out of oil prices, this inflation of 8% or 7%, you realize that oil price is not really very high compared to previous records we saw in the past. So people compare it to the 70s, or 80s. But in real term, in the 80s, oil price was really around 120. So $115 today or even $120 today of oil price is not unusual in the history of the oil industry. And the economy can support the price. Why? Because the importance of oil has been diminishing over time. So in the 1970s, oil had its highest share in our global energy mix, but that share has declined. We are using less and less oil. And that's why when you think about the long term, if you were Saudi Arabia, this is what you would be concerned about. You don't want to kill the goose that gives you the golden eggs, right? Because this is where your money is coming from. Let me switch quickly to gas, and I will conclude on that, even though there is a fly. It likes my perfume, I think. It's flying around me. One small thing I would like to explain about oil and gas. With oil, 5 minutes, can I? Because that's important to understand, that you cannot compare oil with like gas. Why? Oil, most of the oil produced is traded globally. It's oil, it's liquid. You put it on a ship, you put it in a truck, you put it in a pipeline, but most of the oil is traded in ships. Gas, what people don't realize, only a small proportion of gas is traded around the world. And only 13% of that is through ships, through LNG. So it's a very, very small proportion of the gas that is sold around the world that is going through ship, and the other 50% that is sold is via pipeline. And that small distinction makes you realize that even if, for example, if you stop Russian oil from coming to the European market, it will find a way to the global market. It doesn't matter. It will go elsewhere. But with gas, why the EU has not imposed sanctions on gas? Because you cannot suddenly replace a pipeline by another pipeline. Pipeline takes decades to build and establish this network, and LNG is not available everywhere. It takes years to build that capacity of LNG. So that's one thing I wanted to highlight for you. And then not all European, you know this, that not all European countries have the same dependence on Russia. But while we think about the EU being dependent on Russia, because most of the gas that comes to the EU from Russia is pipeline, I've been saying for a while, and I know not many people agree with me, I say that especially in the long term, Russia will be a bigger loser than Europe. Because Russia, more than 85% of its trade relies on pipeline with the EU. Only say 15 or 17% they are doing it via LNG. And they have only one pipeline that connects them to Russia, to China. They want to build another pipeline, but that is not before 2030. So the main infrastructure to sell Russian gas is here in the EU. And therefore, losing the EU market will cause bigger pain for Russia than if the EU loses Russia. I'm not saying it's not going to cause pain in the EU, but the EU, if it invests more in LNG infrastructure, they are better placed as getting greater supplies from elsewhere than Russia losing access to the market. And the reason why I'm showing you this, and let me finish on this one, and later we can talk about North Africa, is that this is Russia's energy strategy 2035, the official energy strategy published by the Russian government. They are looking at how energy markets will look like in the next 10, 15 years. And even though they recognize that the market in Europe is going to shrink because of climate change policies, because of competition from other suppliers, they did not factor in, even in their worst case scenario, the loss of the European market. And actually, if you look here at the EU and at Europe and the former Soviet Union, even if Asia is gaining greater prominence, by 2035, the Europe and former Soviet Union remain the largest market for Russian gas based on what the Russian government was expecting. So that's one thing that has been overlooked in the discussion about how will this hit Russia. But in terms of the importance of North Africa and the dependence on Algeria, but again, I can discuss instead of going through the slides. But Karim, I think you mentioned the political instability in North Africa, because North Africa is particularly important for Spain. Actually, you capture most of the exports of Algeria. To a less extent, Egypt, because Egypt is not connected by pipeline to Europe. It actually sells its LNG, its gas through LNG, but goes mostly to Asia. But the problem in North Africa is two things, in addition to politics. So if you put politics on this side, what you have here is production struggling to increase. This is Algeria, and the production is in the dark line. And this is, this is Egypt, excuse me, and this is Algeria. So production is not rising fast. On the contrary, it went down. And then it came up, and then it went down again in Algeria and Egypt. But worst part is local demand. Consumption in Egypt, in Algeria, has been rising very fast. Actually, Egypt is the largest gas market in Africa, and Algeria is the second largest gas market in Africa. So if you have your production not growing fast, and your consumption is growing fast, the gap between the two, which actually your export, what happens to it? It shrinks. So the real risk in those countries is not geopolitical risk, but the lack of investment. So unless we see major investment going to those countries happening, plus a slowdown in demand growth for natural gas in both Algeria and Egypt, I wouldn't put my money on seeing more substantial quantities of natural gas coming from North Africa to Europe. And let me end here, but then we can discuss further later on during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carole, for this overview on not only the situation of Ukraine and the dependency on Russian gas, but on giving us also this idea of what's happening in the south. I'm sure we can delve into what's going on in the Gulf beyond just how much they're making profits out of this current price increase, and their very privileged place in the market for this. So I will just pass on the word to Gonzalo Escribano. Vamos a escuchar su comentario.
We'll listen to his comments now, and then next we'll have room or time for questions and your reactions. You have the floor, Gonzalo. Do I speak in Spanish? As you wish.
Carole's presentation, so I think it's, I can say it in English, so it will be more comfortable for her. I mean, it's impossible to me to comment all the fields you cover with high competence. Thank you so much for this very compelling and comprehensive presentation, really interesting. Some of the issues you mentioned, about whether this energy crisis is only due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine or not. And I tend to agree with you that there were other pressures going on before. But perhaps the most important one was the action by the Russian 1 year before the invasion. I mean, limiting and restricting gas exports to Europe in order to prevent the Europeans to have a lot of stocks and to have more, degree or more policy space. So, I mean, part of it was a very deliberate strategy and policy by the Russians. It was very well prepared. It's true also that we were on the recovery and the COVID and all that. Yeah, that's true. But we weren't being in that situation without the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we will be, or we should be, in a much worse situation should more strict and stringent measures have been taken in order to prevent the, all this money, all these euros flowing to Mr. Putin, because all the money he has lost because of the loss of production, he has immediately more than recovered because of the increase in prices. And we have not even started to really implementing sanctions that really bite, So get prepared for a really tough energy crisis, in my opinion, if we really go further and the geopolitical situation doesn't ease. My question would be, if I were an Ukrainian, not a single drop of gas will go through my country. And this is what is going to happen. It's happening already. And we are going to see more and more on that. How many more butchers, massacres of people are some countries and our public opinion ready to, before we cut and we really sanction it strongly. And this will entail very strong measures, especially for those countries in the center of Europe, including Germany, that for 2 decades has completely, been very indulgent with Russia. It was very clear, there were all the indicators, there were a lot of warnings from Mediterranean countries. Look more to the south, you have to diversify. It's crazy to be so dependent and vulnerable to Russian energy. And today, we in Spain, we are paying the price in our, our cars and the electricity because of the mistakes of others. And I think there are responsible people for that, with names, commissioners, some of them Germans, that have taken that decision that it was not risky to be depending 45% on Russia, which is crazy. So that's what happened. So it's very important that we really decouple from Russia. It's very difficult to do it in the short term. I would say almost impossible. Let's get prepared for, especially in those countries that depend very much on pipelines, get ready for rationing and all that. It has already happened in Kosovo, in Turkey, in Moldova. So we will get more of that. Especially if we got, general winter is especially tough with us this year, which has not been that one. So this Russian inflación causada por Rusia, I think it's a lot of there. It's a lot of it there, really a lot of it. But it's not all. I agree with you that there is also what they call greenflation, that I don't like at all. La inflación causada por la transición verde, Because it's true, we are going to more expensive. If we really want to incentivize green energy and sustainable energy, we have to make, you know, fossil fuels and traditional energy more expensive. So that will lead to some kind of, you know, more expensive transition. Even if today solar energy is the cheapest energy in history. But you also need a lot of things that we don't have. I mean, you need, you know, for electric mobility, you need chargers, you need infrastructure, and so on and so forth. A lot of associated technologies we don't have today with us. And it's true that are we going to change our dependency from Russia, from dependency from lithium? Well, yeah, we have to start to think about it. But the magnitude of it is much smaller. I mean, when you got a car, and you got a fuel car, every week, I mean, depending on how much you drive, you have to go and fill the tank. When you got an electric vehicle, you change the battery with lithium once every 10 years. So, I mean, it's a very different thing. It's a very different thing. Lithium you can recycle, you can find new, probably in 10 years' time, when lithium will be completely exhausted, we will have another technology. So, it's important, we have to monitor, we have probably to establish strategic stocks or whatever, but in my opinion, we don't have to approach this issue from a neo-Malthusian perspective, okay? I think there are solutions for this. It's a constraint, we have to monitor it, we need to devise strategies, but I don't think it will be a bottleneck to prevent the energy transition. There will be solutions for that. Totally agree with the policy reversals. Hey, you are in Spain, here we are the champions of pendular policies, you know. From one day, we are an energy hub. We wake up the day later and we are an energy island. So, I mean, these things change quite fast here in Spain. And these policy reversals are, I totally agree with you. Either if you are in oil and gas, you are in renewables, whatever, this policy uncertainty is a very bad signal. It's very difficult for the companies. Whatever you prefer, I mean, you are invested in Repsol, this is bad for Repsol. Not these days, by the way. You are invested in Iberdrola, that's very bad for Iberdrola, because if you don't get a predictable institutional setting, it's very difficult for you to get the real incentives and to respond. So, yeah, these policy reversals are crazy. Are we going, and I totally agree with you also, with this idea that the climate security and energy security are two parts of the same coin. We do polls here, public opinion polls at the Elcano Real Institute here in Spain. For a decade now, when you ask the people, don't you have something that you used to have in Casa Árabe, these funny things to, okay, para espantar las moscas, ¿no? Okay, where I was in the, oh yeah, climate change. You ask to the people, what are the main priorities for the Spanish public opinion in foreign policy? First one, fighting climate change. That's the first one. Second, development cooperation. Third one, promoting Spanish economic interests abroad. Fourth one, energy security. These are the four. Over the last months and let's say 2 years, we see climate change going down and we see energy security going up. To the point that probably today in Spain, and something very similar is happening all over Europe, the twin priorities and preferences of the Spanish citizens regarding foreign policy are fighting climate change and ensuring energy, you know, affordability and access and whatever and whatever. So this is why it's so crazy, and now I'm talking in the Spanish, but also we can talk that in a European level. It's incredible that when you look at ideology, you see that those that place climate change among the first priority are all of them in the left and the center. And those who place energy security as a first priority are voters to the right. Look what kind of polarization we got in our society. And this is also happening when you read experimental energy economics in the United States. You see that people filter their reactions to policies according to their attitudes and ideology. And this is a problem because we are politicizing technologies. and this is a real problem. If you are from the right, you don't want to buy an electric vehicle, you don't want to install a PV plate in your, you don't want to do energy efficiency. On the contrary, you want to show that you are against that because you got control aversion. On the other side, if you are California-like, you want to have a Tesla because your neighbor will feel peer pressure and then you will get an electric vehicle. You will install PV plates in Germany because you want to transmit to your neighborhood that you are a clean guy. And that pressure will be felt, but not in Spain. Hey, PV plates in Germany are much higher. I mean, something like 3 times, 4 times those that we have in our roofs in Spain. This is not only bad regulation, this is also bad narratives being transmitted to the consumers, because in Spain it makes a lot of sense to do that. But we don't get the narrative to combine them. And we have to reach every profile of consumer with a different narrative. Those that are in the left told them climate change, pollution. Those that are on the right told them energy security, affordability. Construct target narratives, because if not, and in Spain we see it a lot lately, my concern is that we can promote a disaffection to the energy transition among a significant part of the population that we really need them to get them on board in order to achieve it. Finally, I have 2 questions. First one, I see we have recently a seminar with Middle East analysts. You know, we got somebody from Casa, we got people from the Emirates, and we realize how different transition pathways are in the European Union and the Gulf countries. For instance, I mean, there they talk about carbon capture and storage. The IPCC also says that we need carbon capture and storage. They talk nuclear. They talk synthetic fuels. They talk the circular carbon economy. They talk blue economy in order to capture carbon in oceans and so on and so forth. This is a much different approach that we are following here. And it's good to be aware of it. And try to find, I don't know whether a common ground or complementarities or whatever, but at least be aware that not everybody in the world is following the European pathway of accelerated renewables deployment, and that there are other pathways that for us could be not that appropriate, but are perfectly respectful to some extent. So my question would be, how do you see these pathways in the countries? Because we can have countries like, Saudi Arabia, you mentioned it, the Emirates. They got a lot of money, they got financial markets, they got technological capability. They can become what they call themselves converters. They convert from the oil and gas world to the renewable world. They export hydrogen, synthetic fuels, all of this, you know. They capture gas and they export decarbonized gas, all these kind of things. But we got other countries like Libya, you mentioned, or Algeria. Perhaps they cannot redeem and convert, their oil and gas, their fossil sins. It's not that easy for them, because probably they won't get all the financing, all the technical capabilities. So how do you see this heterogeneity that you already mentioned in the current state of energy in the region, how this heterogeneity can evolve and further develop in the future? And my second question, you mentioned also OPEC. Exactly the same question on geopolitical pathways rather than energy transition pathways. You mentioned that it's very difficult for many countries to be assertive or to pressure Russia. When we look who has not voted in the last voting in the General Council, we got very funny cases like Algeria, for sure, and everybody expected abstention, but Morocco didn't want to vote. These are very clear geopolitical pressures. So, is it going to be feasible for Gulf and North African countries to balance, because that's what they want, and I think they got perfect right to get their own position, autonomous position, but to what extent in this new energy world we are going, it will be feasible for those countries at the same time playing Russia and being kind to the West? You know, that would be my two easy questions for you.
Muchas gracias, Gonzalo. Would you like to just take from these two questions, answer to Gonzalo's two questions, Carole?
Yeah, and can I just
And react to
what he
his
said
comments,
earlier?
yes.
Yeah, if that is possible. First, Gonzalo, I'll have to disagree with you on Russia's role in terms of the prices that we are seeing in Europe. Because, and again, I didn't want to take you through the details, Russia was one of the factors that led to the increase in gas prices in Europe, but not the only one. Actually, it all started in Asia. They had a very tough winter in winter 2020, and prices there, even we saw for LNG, record prices. And because LNG is like ships, so whatever was coming to Europe went to Asia instead in terms of LNG. So it was this diversion, that's how it started. And the second thing was also low storage level in the EU, very cold winter. I remember I was in Germany during the lockdown, and in May or June I was still wearing a jacket. It was a very, very cold winter there. And so many other factors, the supply chain bottlenecks, there were because of the lockdowns and not enough staff. So even at certain ports, the Panama, for example, canal, there were not enough staff there to allow the ships to pass on time. That led to congestion. So many factors came into play that contributed to this rapid increase in gas. And that's why I showed that slide about the European gas prices versus elsewhere. And of course, Russia took advantage of that. They deliberately curtailed supply because they wanted to get more prices and more revenues, and also for geopolitical pressure for Nord Stream 2. But it's not the only factor. It added up to a long list of factors, and today, of course, it's a prominent factor that comes on top of everything else. For sanctioning Russia, and this is why I put this here, it's not just what the EU can do. As long as half of the world, which includes the largest importer of oil, that is India, that is China, or China first and then India comes, do not join the Western efforts to sanction Russia, then oil will find a way, Russian oil will continue to find its way into the market. That's a plain fact.
And
so
that
for...
will not happen.
Sorry?
I mean, that will not happen. China and India will...
They clearly said, at least the Indian were very blunt and said, because why? They're also benefiting from the Russian oil being sold at a discount. So it's $30 below the market price, the other benchmark, the Brent. So they are making a killing, their refineries, from buying Russian oil. And as long as you have that reality, that half of the world is not joining forces with the EU, with the Western powers to sanction Russia, the economic pain on Russia, of course there will be economic pain, and the economy is going to shrink by nearly 10%, some say 15% this year. I'm not denying that, but it's not going to bring them on their knees. That's important to remember. The other thing, let me now maybe answer your questions. First of all, about the difference between the Middle East and the EU, but also across the MENA region. Of course, I cannot compare the MENA, the main oil and gas producers, with the EU, because there they have oil and gas resources that last for decades. In Kuwait, their oil resources, oil reserves, they can last for another 98 years, right? So they want to do as much as they can to extend the lifespan of their most valuable assets, because these economies across the MENA, from the Gulf to North Africa, they are hugely dependent on oil and gas revenues. And they want to see the market for their oil and gas for as long as possible. So what technology do you invest in to make that possible? That meets the climate change agenda, but at the same time allows you to keep on selling your oil, so there is a market for it. You tell people, my oil is going to go, whatever it's going to emit carbon emissions, I'm going to capture it and bury it. It's not going to go into the atmosphere, right? So that's a very strong selling point, and that's why they are quite big and quite strong on carbon capture and storage, not only because they have the capital to do that, but that's a technology that will allow them to meet the global climate change agenda, but at the same time maintaining the market for their most precious asset. Hydrogen. They've been producing hydrogen for many years. You know, that's what you use hydrogen in your petrochemicals to reduce the impurities of your products, for instance. So they have the know-how and they have the technology. And hydrogen is very convenient to get hydrogen from oil and gas, particularly from gas. And again, it extends the shelf life of their assets. So that is primarily, if I go back to the granularity of why they are doing this but not that, it goes down to their long-term strategic interest that they would like to safeguard an economic interest because their economies are not diversified. However, what we are also seeing in the Middle East is, for example, a push for renewable energy. And that is, for me, a very clever thing to do. Because at the moment, if you look, for example, around the world, which region is still burning oil in power generation substantially? It's the Middle East and maybe North Africa as well, though they use also gas. So in Saudi Arabia, on a hot summer day, you can burn each day the equivalent of what the United Kingdom is producing, 1 million barrels of oil per day. You can just put it in electricity to generate electricity. That is a pure waste. Whereas if you rely more on gas and nuclear and solar and wind, but primarily solar and nuclear, then you free more of that oil and you sell it abroad. So instead of wasting it domestically and burning it, you make more money out of it, because even in the worst case scenario for climate change, that we will always use oil and gas for the foreseeable future. And they have an advantage over everybody else. They are the low-cost producers. So somebody will always buy their oil, and they want to make sure that they are not burning it domestically, they are securing it. So they see climate change not really a threat with their policy, but mainly an opportunity to do other things. For North Africa, my problem in North Africa, you have the political instability, for example, Libya, and unless that really resolves itself, where will the capital come from? The government does not have the money to invest. You need to set up, and I'm not saying the government should invest in these things, but they should encourage capital to come to the country. Who would go and put their money in already risky venture in a high-risk country? So Libya is really, what I say from an investment perspective, a roller coaster. It does not give you the confidence that you need to commit your money for long-term investment. Algeria, it may be more politically stable than Libya, for instance, but still they do have the political instability, but they also have not really that investment-friendly environment. Their regulations, and they try to do some reforms to their legislation, but go and try to get a permit on going in Algeria. So even though you get the government giving you the license to proceed, but to get it approved and processed, so even let's say if there are reforms there, the level of bureaucracy is killing. And investors don't want to be stuck in red tape and bureaucracy. They want to have the confidence that if they decide to invest today, they can get things going tomorrow and later. So that's the problem, you know, and I don't like to talk about region, and that's why I singled out the GCC and did not even include Iraq, because even Iraq has its own problems. It's like individual countries have different problems, but the GCC, you can put them together. Even though, economically speaking, countries like the UAE and Kuwait are better off than, let's say, Saudi Arabia, because they have invested their money in sovereign wealth fund. It takes me to your other question about OPEC. OPEC and Russia, when they first came together in December 2016, this was not what actually, it was not, of course they came together because they were responding to a common challenge. That was the US shale production of oil and gas. Because US shale, you know, transformed the whole geopolitical situation in the world. It gave the US the independence that they wanted, and they became the largest oil and gas producer in the world. So the problem was too big for OPEC to handle on its own. And Russia was also struggling because after the Crimea annexation, oil prices collapsed. It was a coincidence that happened around the same time. And they also wanted to see higher oil prices. So it was common interest that brought them together. But it's not only oil price. If you look after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the sanctions imposed by the US, by the EU on Russia, you can see that Russia built stronger economic ties with the Middle East. So we started to see more investment from sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East going to Russia. And that, if you look at it, we see a bit of disconnect because they were fighting each other on Syria. You see, and Russia taking the side of Assad, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE taking the side of the protesters or the rebels there. But still, economic interest proved to be strong, especially that it all started to happen for the Middle East during the Obama era, where he said in an interview, it was published in The Atlantic, he said that he had enough of what was going on in the Middle East and the Middle East should solve itself. And that brought those interests between Russia and the Middle East together. So it's a combination of economic interest, strategic interest, and political interest that are still with us today. And even when Biden came to power, remember we had a webinar in December 2020, excuse me, and we said, or October, I don't know when the reactions were happening in the US exactly, and we said that if Biden came to power, we're going to see Russia becoming closer to the Middle East because Biden was not really a fan of Russia. So those two parties, the OPEC and Russia, at the moment, they have a mutual interest, and I see those interests lasting longer because of the control over the market. You need to have this kind of volume to influence the market. So I don't see it going anywhere unless we see tremendous pressure and change from the US, at least vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. At the moment, I don't see it going anywhere.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. We will shift to some of the questions. We're already getting some questions on our YouTube channel. I just wanted, before Carole, if you could just tell us, we saw a few years ago the division that was within the GCC, mainly trying to isolate Qatar. It had many, let's say, consequences regionally and realignments with Egypt supporting the Saudi and UAE versus Qatar. So I don't know if this has an effect on the energy market because of this division within the GCC, because you speak about the GCC as a unity, and we have said that the Arab region, the Middle East and North Africa region is quite diverse. We cannot treat it as a monolithical region, but even within the GCC, which seems to be a unity in itself, it's not exactly that united. So I don't know if there is some kind of specificity to concretely Qatar as opposed to the rest of the GCC.
If I convey the sense of unity in the GCC, then I'm a terrible communicator, because the GCC, when I said that they share common situation, common data point, but not really unity. Unity is a big word, and actually, if you look at the GCC, it's a pretty fragmented region. They have lots of disputes on, land disputes, for example, between the Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. You see, so it's very common. We don't hear often about it, but it's far from being a unified region. And even their position vis-a-vis Qatar. Actually, when you said about Qatar, one thing came to my mind, that Qatar actually emerged, especially if you put it in the context of today's development, especially when you compare it to Russia. Qatar has emerged a winner from that diplomatic row in the GCC. Why? Because it did not cut its supplies of gas. There is only one pipeline that connects different countries in the Middle East. That is the pipeline that goes from Qatar via Oman to the UAE. And many people feared that Qatar was going to cut supplies. Now, you might say that, the UAE would have retaliated, they would have stopped their ships going through the Straits of Hormuz, but still, Qatar also conveyed the message that it was, despite disputes on politics, they treat business like business. So they maintain the reputation as a reliable supplier, and that is very important for them, for the Asian market. But there were a couple of other things that affected energy markets, maybe not globally, but at the moment regionally. We are seeing greater interest in domestic exploitation of natural gas. What people don't realize is that the Middle East sits on the majority of natural gas reserves as a region in the world, but they are not the largest producer in the world. Actually, natural gas, because often you produce it in some areas along oil, so it has been curtailed by oil policy. But what we saw in recent years, we saw countries there announcing very ambitious gas plans to be not only self-sufficient, so they don't import gas anymore, but they start exporting gas, because so far in the region, only Qatar is the meaningful exporter, and Oman to a much lesser extent. But all the other countries are either, not importing, not exporting, or importing gas from elsewhere. So we are seeing a push for natural gas. Whether they will become exporters, that's a different story. But that is one of the immediate effects I can think of in terms of impact on energy market. But it did not really destabilize global markets because nobody cut supplies. Qatar maintained its supplies, and the UAE did not stop the ships of LNG going through Qatar. That's why that dispute was GCC dispute and stayed a GCC dispute. It did not spill over to the rest of the world.
Thank you. No sé si aquí en la sala tenemos alguna pregunta.
I'm wondering whether there are any questions in the room, any comments. Yes, please go ahead. You can ask your questions in Spanish or in English.
I'd like to raise a point in order to know what you think about it. For last years, European oil and gas companies have been steering their investments from upstream activities to other, let's say, more green or more sustainable activities. This has been driven by environmental policies and also by constraints in the financial markets to fund these activities. Should we expect any kind of change in this, or this pathway is clear and straight? Thank you.
You're absolutely right that we saw, at least among European oil companies, major oil companies, we saw a greater drive towards investing in greener energy, greener projects. It doesn't necessarily be solar energy. If you invest, for example, in carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and usage and storage, this is also classified by the industry as a green project. But to say that they are moving away from investing in oil and gas because they want to invest in that portfolio, I don't see it that way. I see it more like complementing, investing some of that capital. But really, the money that is generated is from oil and gas. And you can look at the share price of these companies. You can see at their financial performance these days. 2 years ago, nobody wanted to buy shares in oil and gas, and we saw how the value of the companies went down, only to recover because of the recovery in oil and gas prices. And this year, I think it's the IEA which is predicting a couple of trillions of dollars in profitability achieved by the oil and gas industry globally. So surely, they will have more capital to invest in conventional oil and gas, especially that today they are getting better signal from governments to support oil and gas investment. And also we should expect to see more investment in green projects. However, this is where it becomes interesting. In the longer term, if you believe that oil will continue to be in demand, but Western companies will move more and more, let's say, from their conventional business to green business, who is going to meet the demand in the market? It's the national oil companies of the Middle East, for instance. And that's why if you look at the Middle Eastern national oil companies, you can see they are committing hundreds of billions of dollars, not in green projects. They are investing in green projects, but it's very small compared to the capital they are putting in oil and gas. But they are investing heavily in oil and gas because they know that if Western companies don't invest in oil and gas, there will still be a gap in the market that needs to be filled. And this is where those companies are going to step in. From its security of supply perspective, here from the EU, you might end up actually relying more on OPEC and a state-owned company than less throughout the energy transition until you have a full-blown energy transition. So it's much more than thinking about the investment today of energy companies.
Gonzalo, ¿quieres agregar algo?
Did you want to add anything?
No, do you want to further elaborate? I think it's not necessary.
Okay, we have another question, this one from Santiago Gonzalez. He asks that we have gas reserves in places, in conflicted places, in Lebanese waters, in Palestine, Gaza. So he says Israel will have the power to extract that gas. Will Greece, Cyprus, Italy, and the EU allow this? Although it may affect negatively Arab countries?
Yeah, I think what Gonzalez, right? Santiago, yeah.
Yes.
Is asking about is a dispute in Eastern Mediterranean. I come from Lebanon, so I have first-hand exposure to what's going on there, and I have to be careful with what I say. But, you know, those resources of the gas resources that were discovered, and they were discovered offshore Israel. It was with Leviathan and Tamar, and I think back in 2009 and 2010. And back then, they were the largest discoveries of gas in the world. Then there was Aphrodite field in Cyprus. Lebanon has not made any discovery to date, and Syria has not really explored the Mediterranean waters for natural gas. Now, at the same time, just to put this issue into perspective, at the same time, East Africa, Mozambique, and Tanzania made similar discoveries. Mozambique is about to become a major LNG exporter, and Eastern Mediterranean are still trying to resolve those disputes. But the problem with the East Mediterranean, apart from the technical challenge, because really these fields were in the deep water and there's no infrastructure. Israel is relying on Egypt to export its gas. So this is the important role of Egypt, and I should have mentioned it earlier. It's primarily want to be a hub, whereby even if it cannot produce enough itself, it can take the gas from Israel, it can take the gas from Cyprus, and maybe potentially from Lebanon, and then liquefy it, make it liquid, put it on ships and selling into LNG. But for that to work, I mean, with natural gas, again, we talk about gas, not oil. Gas infrastructure is very important. Connection and cooperation with neighboring countries is very important. You know, look at the North Sea. The UK has its own gas and Norway has its own gas, but they are connected. You know, Norway sends even some of its gas to the UK, and from there it goes to Europe. So you need this kind of interconnection between countries in one region. And for me, as long as Eastern Mediterranean is politically fragmented, and it's not just Lebanon and Israel and Palestine, it's also Turkey, northern Turkey, and Greece, and Cyprus. Wherever you look, you know, and then you have Syria, and Syria has not really agreed on its borders with its neighbors, still leaving that area open. So wherever you look in the region, you have disputes between two neighboring countries. And that by itself has been the handicap for the exploitation of the resource, in addition to the technical challenges, because I never really believed in a pipeline coming from Israel to Cyprus to Greece. I mean, have you looked at the seabed and saw how challenging that is going to be, how costly that is going to be when there's lots of LNG circulating around? So it does not make sense, technically speaking, but the political situation, unless we see a peace between Lebanon and Israel and the issue of northern Cyprus is resolved, I would keep my expectations low about Eastern Mediterranean role in global gas markets. It would be an indirect role through Egypt, but not really a major exporter by itself.
Thank you. ¿Más preguntas por aquí?
Any further questions from here? Yes, go ahead. Good evening. I'm Georgi Palosov, and I'm a Finnish journalist. I'm rather new in this field.
I started in Spanish. So my name is Jyrki Palo. I'm from a Finnish newspaper, economic paper. But lately I have been, like a freshman, taken into the gas business. And what I would like to ask is to write about gas business. Now, what I would like to know is, how does the price get formed? Like for example, for a pipeline gas, I mean, it's quite easy, much easier to understand LNG price formation, but what about the pipeline gas? Does it get affected now with the rise of the LNG gas? That's Or,
You know, actually, I had a slide here, but I saved you. The details. I wasn't sure what is the interest of the audience. But what you touched on is another key difference between oil and gas. With oil, we talk about global oil price. Yeah, you go on Bloomberg app and you can trace the oil price every day with a small differential between quality, Brent and then WTI and Russian oil, etc. But there's a global market. With gas, there are at least 12 different pricing mechanisms. So that's why earlier I showed you European gas, but I also showed you LNG price in Japan. I showed you US price, gas price, and they are living in different worlds. They are not like following the same, level of increase, for instance. And that is because you have different pricing mechanisms in different regions. But the two most prominent mechanisms are either you sell, like what you have in North America, in the US, so American exporters, they sell their gas under what we call spot price, so demand and supply, market price, whether it's LNG or pipeline. But elsewhere, for example, in Asia, they get most of their gas through what we call long-term contracts. And in those long-term contracts, the most common method of pricing gas is by indexing it to oil. So you use a formula and you say, okay, my gas will be equal to the price of oil plus or minus this multiplied by that. So you're linking it to the oil price, or you link it, as in some places in Europe, like in Germany, to oil products such as diesel. Yeah? But it's linked to the oil price in these long-term contracts. So in the long-term contracts, you find that the price of gas tends to follow the price of oil and what happens in oil. In Europe, it's a mixture of long-term contracts and spot pricing. So when you go west towards, for example, the UK, you can see market-based mechanism because it started in the US, then it came to Europe via the UK. But the more you go to east and south, you find long-term oil price indexed, as you find in Asia. And that's why I put here that most of the pricing for gas today is still long-term oil indexed, but spot pricing is becoming more popular, especially as the US is exporting its gas in bigger quantity, and that by itself is encouraging spot pricing. Yeah, so it's much more complicated for natural gas than it is for oil, but link it to those two simple pricing mechanisms. That should do for now.
Carole, I had a question that raises from somehow a point that Gonzalo made regarding Spain, and it is about the politicization of technology, right? And how he said that across the political spectrum, you get people that are left-leaning who are more of a climate change supporters and will therefore support renewable energies, whereas the people who are more right-leaning will be more into securing energy by all means. So I was wondering if this fragmentation across political lines is valid elsewhere. If it's across Europe, maybe it applies pretty much the same. But the moment you cross over south and in the MENA countries, it just doesn't apply. It's a question.
Yeah, I mean, because the political systems across the MENA are very different, right? It's a different story, but let's not go there. But I like this idea.
If you can really conduct opinion polls, I guess in some occasions you really can't.
So that's a different story in the MENA region. But I also liked what you said of the politicization of technologies. But it's true. I mean, I think this before the crisis happened, we had the debate about climate change was deeply polarized. And as if, nobody was really thinking, like somewhere in the middle, taking the realities on the ground, like with this data, which shows you how heavily our system is dependent on fossil fuel versus safeguarding the planet. And that's why I think the silver lining, in my opinion, of the current crisis is re-establishing some kind of balance. You don't want to make a U-turn, but you can restore the balance of the debate. And I want to add just to that, before I elaborate a little bit more on that, look at the contradiction in policies. Gonzalo, you said that we need high prices to support the energy transition, or the energy transition, it's common to have these kind of prices to support our transition from a system dominated by fossil fuel to a system dominated by green energy. What are many governments in Europe doing today to alleviate the impact of the economic crisis and the energy crisis? They are introducing energy caps, price caps. They are offering subsidies, right? So that by itself is going to extend the pain, because instead of telling people, all right, you should find a way to reduce your consumption, because that's exactly what we want you to do. We want you to rely less on oil and gas. But when you go and you reduce the price impact on them, you are simply telling them it's okay to consume more oil and gas. So I think there's also, we have to understand that's not just the politicization in terms of, climate change versus other things, but there is a social dimension. After all, these are democracies. People vote for these governments. They want to go with the public opinion, even if economically speaking it doesn't make much sense. But so I can see there is this disconnect when it comes to energy policy, and I'm hoping that this crisis will reestablish this connect between, policymakers. And that's why I call it earlier the age of policy confusion, and I can go on and on about the list of contradictions between what is being said and the targets that we set for energy, and economic reality and social dimension. But the energy problem is by itself too complicated, and its definition can vary not between one country and the other, but between one administration and the other, as we see, for example, between Trump and Biden. I cannot say that one was right, one wrong. They were looking at the energy problem from a different perspective. And that's what you will keep on having in these countries, especially in democracies. But I'm hoping that we can depoliticize technologies. I'm going to steal that expression from you, by the way, in my future writings.
If I may, I would like to add something that I think it's important, because, okay, looking at it from the European Union, things are going to change too. If you are, let's put simple examples. You're in Morocco. You are exporting electricity to Spain. The electricity mix in Morocco is 80% coal and fuel, especially after the disconnection of Algerian gas. In a few years, I hope, we will have what is called a carbon border adjustment mechanism. That is, those countries that doesn't have an ETS or a carbon pricing mechanism, as we got, will be subject to a kind of border tax or tariff, call it whatever you want. Then Morocco will have to pay a tariff for these electricity exports. At the beginning will be for electricity, petrochemicals, I think steel and these kind of things, and others. That for Morocco is very important because of fertilizers. So let's put the case of Morocco. What makes sense for Morocco? It makes sense to export the few amount of renewable electricity they got to Europe. That it makes sense for them to use those resources, scarce resources, into producing green hydrogen to export it to Germany. Or is more sensible to use that renewable electricity, those renewable resources, to produce green hydrogen, to nurture their fertilizers industry, and exporting green fertilizers or green steel or whatever, rather than exporting the resource? Because it makes no sense. I mean, we need in Europe, along with this CBAM and mechanism that is going to be very conflictual with other countries, especially with the Arab region, very conflictual. we have to put along import sustainability criteria. It is not possible that you can be importing green hydrogen from a country that is not fulfilling their own commitments within, I don't know, the Paris Treaty or whatever. Those imports should be additional. You know, in order not to postpone the problem, because this is kind of procrastination. I mean, rather than using your green hydrogen for yourself, you export it to me. I mean, why? So, at some point in Europe, and this is going to be very conflictual, and it's already starting, we already got some concerns about resource governance, because we ask for, that you have to be very transparent, and you have to, disclose the payments to oil and gas companies and mining and so on and so forth. You have to be disclosing what is the value of your methane emissions, because you have to, this is starting and it's going forward and forward. So at some point, it wouldn't make sense to import, I don't know, green hydrogen from a country who does not respect human rights, that is using only renewables to export and not for their own consumption, that doesn't respect, human security basics and fundamentals. So at some point, environmental damage, whatever, at some point the European Union will introduce this. Is this going to be called green or human protectionism? It could be. But in my opinion, what is important is that somehow we have to ensure that we do not replicate the same governance problem that has led to the energy crisis we are experiencing today, in my opinion, with a big weight of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On this we agree that we disagree. But in any case, we have to start to think not to have a new OPEC, and for sure this is going to be much smaller, much smaller. We are not going to see hydrogen exchanges at the level of gas exchanges. We are not going to see that. And it doesn't make much sense to import, not to charge against, always against our friends, bring in hydrogen from Chile, it doesn't make sense here in Spain, probably, in Europe. Probably not ammonia, perhaps things, but this is not going to be the same scale, but especially, please beware, we do not replicate the same governance problems, because in these holes of governance we see cartels in OPEC, we see bad resource governance in the countries we have been mentioning. If we do not put the institutions in place to prevent this from happening again, what we are going to see is the fossilization of renewable energies, and we are going to suffer from path dependency and forget about all the opportunities and the good things, because in my opinion, geopolitically, we got much better opportunities as it's much less geopolitically loaded renewables than oil and gas. So we got that opportunity, but we need good governance and good institutions starting with Europe. And this is going to hurt probably other countries and other producing countries. And it would be good to establish a common pathway in order to not to build new geopolitical faults and cleavages, like a CBAM, like a new, try to work it out in order not to this become a new, border.
Thank you. Well, we have reached our time limit, but I don't know if Carole, you'd like to just wrap it up, or final comment from you?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me with you again. I know there's a lot to cover, and I told you it's a global and regional and local and domestic problem. It's a very, very big problem that affects us all everywhere. But if I may perhaps conclude on referring to a point that González mentioned, because that deserves another separate session, that is the governance of the energy transition.
Oh, yeah.
Mentioned, I've worked in governance of the extractive sector. And not, by the way, we haven't done the full work in the oil and gas sector. Why sanctions on oil trade, for example, don't really work? Because when you try to look, we did lots of work on governance of exploration of oil and gas, but try to trace oil and gas being, or oil being traded, that becomes a black hole on many fronts. So that by itself is an area that I don't know how it skipped the radar of governance principles. When it comes to the energy transition, what worries me is that most of the minerals and the metals that we need to produce solar panels, to produce wind turbines, they are concentrated in countries that are either described as politically unstable, or they have very weak institutional framework, or they have endemic corruption problems. And you can see the data. You can go on the World Bank and check the situation in those countries. So I fear that while we might be thinking about saving the planet, we might end up with another problem that we're not talking about, and that we become dependent on countries. If today we think OPEC is not reliable, and to be fair, they have been reliable in a certain way, then wait till you see other problems coming if we don't tackle this issue of governance of the energy transition and the institutional quality and political fragility of countries that will become important for the energy transition. So that definitely is a topic that requires much more attention than it has received so far.
Muy bien, pues muchísimas gracias.
That's wonderful. Thank you ever so much to Carole. And Gonzalo, thank you ever so much to you all for coming and for participating in this room in Alcalá 62. Of those of you who are following us too on our YouTube channel, we're almost concluding this conference for this, or the conferences during the summer season, and getting prepared now for the return to school in September. And what we do have is we're continuing with our cultural activities. As you can see, we do have an exhibition currently from Foto España, and another one that will be inaugurated next Wednesday in 2 days' time. Part of Foto España 2, the light from the photographer from Morocco, Munir Fatmi. And so therefore, we will most probably do a close follow-up of the evolution of gas and, of course, oil. As Carole quite rightly pointed out, even if this does go hand in hand with these the two very different markets, two very different animals with two different governance styles, but there's no doubt that we're concerned about this situation, just as all consumers are, but also as analysts of the Middle East and Mediterranean area, and seeing how it affects countries like Spain and other countries in Europe. So without further ado, I'd like to close the session. Thank you very much. See you again soon, and see you at casaarabe.es. Bye-bye.